What should a person say immediately upon awakening?
Most people have been taught, and by years of habit, are used to saying immediately upon waking, Modeh ani lefanecha melech hay v'kayam, etc. The well-known formula that appears in almost any siddur that you would choose to open. What many people do not know is that this is not, most definitely not, what the Talmud states, and not what all the Rishonim state as well. That nusach of Modeh ani lefanecha was in fact invented and formulated only about 4 centuries ago, and for the reason that we are about to explain. Because when we do look at the Talmud, what we find is something quite different. In Masechet Birkot, Daf Samech Amud Bet 60b, the Talmud Bavli states as follows: Ki mit'ar, when a person awakes, that it means immediately upon waking, Omer, he should say, Elohai, neshama shenatata bi tuhora, ata yasarta, etc., etc. The well-known bracha of Elohai, neshama, which appears again in every siddur, and most people are used to saying not upon waking, but later when they go to shul, they go to the Beit Knesset, or wherever they daven, they say this as part of a list of brachot that are referred to as Birkot HaShachar, in other words, the brachot that a person says in the morning, in the early morning. But that's not, however, as we see, what the Talmud states. The Talmud states that immediately upon waking you make this bracha. And then it goes on to say, Ki shama kol tarnuhola, when the person hears the rooster crowing in the morning, then he makes the bracha, vina, which is a bracha of thanks to HaShem for organizing the world in such a way, and this is how things used to be, of course, even though they are largely not so. It's not largely not so today, that people would hear a rooster in the morning. People lived in a lifestyle in a manner which meant that practically people always heard the roosters making themselves heard very loudly in the early morning, and this was a kind of natural alarm clock. And this is how HaShem organized the world. And therefore it's a very useful and helpful thing for human beings to have this natural biological alarm clock, so to speak. The Talmud goes on to say, what one does, by the way, I should mention here, what one does, what one says or does not say if one does not hear a rooster, if one lives in a place, which is true for most people probably today in the Western world, where a person does not hear roosters in the morning, then there is a mahaloketh discussion amongst the Rishonim whether one should or should not say that particular bracha, which is something we can discuss another time. The Talmud goes on to say, Ki patah eineh, when he opens his eyes or rubs his eyes, one says the bracha, Baruch pokeach ibrim. And then the next statement in the Talmud is Ki thoreth v'yothev, when a person sits up or begins to move himself, before he stands up, he makes the bracha Baruch matir asurim. Ki lovesh, and when he gets dressed or begins to get dressed, or puts on the first articles of clothing to cover his nakedness, then he makes the bracha Baruch malbish arumim. Blessed is he who clothes the naked, etc. And the list goes on. So what we see from the Talmud clearly is that these barachot known as Birkot HaShachar, such as Pokeach Ivrim, Malbish Arumim, Zoqef Kefufim, which is the bracha that one says when one stands on one's feet, these barachot are to be said immediately upon waking, and each of these barachot is connected to and refers to a particular action, a particular fact or reality that occurs in the life of every person upon waking. The first, of course, is the very fact that one has awoken at all, because it is not a given, as we will discuss later. It is not a given that if you go to sleep that you will necessarily wake up in the morning. And after that, one thanks HaShem for one's eyes, that work, that one opens one's eyes and one can see something, and that one can move one's body, one is not paralyzed, and that one can place one's feet on the ground and has firm ground and a place to stand on, and one can get up and then can get dressed. These are all things that we have to be keenly aware of, how much we owe HaShem in gratitude, in sincere and heartfelt gratitude every morning anew. That is the message that we hear from the Talmud quite clearly. And this is what we find, for example, in the Rambam. The Rambam is not alone in this, as we will explain, but Rambam, for example, writes in Perek Shvi'i, the 7th chapter, Halacha Gimel, in Hilchot Tefillah Birkat Kohanim, he says, "B'sha'ashi yikas b'sof shenato," when a person awakes at the end of his sleep. In other words, not if one awakes in the middle of the night. If one wakes up at 2 in the morning, for whatever reason, then goes back to sleep, one does not make the bracha at that point. But when one wakes up at the end of one's sleep, mevarech, he says the bracha, "Wahu al mitatho kach." Rambam here clearly goes out of his way to stress that this bracha is to be said by a person when he is still on his bed, before he even stands up, even before he places his feet on the ground. As soon as one is conscious and awake and intends to remain awake, Rambam says, "Wahu al mitatho kach," and he is still on his bed, he says as follows, "Elohai, my God, handwashing shenafata bit Torah," and then he goes through, gives the nusach, gives the text of this bracha in full. And then he goes on to say, again, based on what we just saw in the Gemara, "Keshe kol atarnagol," when a person hears the rooster crow, he says the bracha, "Mevarech hanoten lasechui vina." "Keshe lovesh b'gado," when he puts on his clothing, he makes the bracha, "Malbish aromim," etc., etc. When he sits on his bed, Rambam says, "Keshe yeshev al mitatho," he makes the bracha, "Matir asurim," and so on. And we find the very same thing in many of the very early sources, the Geonim, for example, of Bavel, the heads of the great yeshivot in Bavel, going back 11, 1200 and 1300 years. We find the very same system described by these Geonim. For instance, in Halachot Gedolot, the earliest, one of the earliest halachic texts, post-Talmudic halachic texts that we have, or for example in the Sidur of Rav Natronai Gaon, and in other sources from that period, we find this very same thing. They quote the Talmud exactly as we find it before us. They state, when upon waking, a person makes this bracha Elohai neshama shenatata bit Torah. And when one opens one's eyes or rubs one's eyes, one says Pokeach Ibrim. And when one gets dressed, one says Malbish Arumim. In other words, they're just quoting the Gemara essentially word for word. This is true of the Halachot Gedolot, Rav Natronai Gaon. This is also true of the Rif, for example, who always follows in the footsteps of the Geonim. And therefore it is clear that any of the Rishonim, any of the ancient halachic sources that simply quote the Gemara and do not add or detract from what it says, had in mind clearly that which is obvious from the Gemara itself, namely that we make these brachot immediately upon waking and in connection with these specific actions, for the reason that I mentioned. In other words, that when one takes note of the fact that one has awoken, one is alive and conscious and healthy, as opposed to the state in which one was just a few moments before, when one was asleep, when one was unconscious and unaware of his surroundings, and the very fact that one wakes up at all, which is, as we said, not to be taken for granted. Immediately upon waking, one makes that bracha. Why? Because obviously a person who thanks HaShem for this fact of just having awoken, or thanks HaShem for allowing his body to be fully functional and healthy, so that he's able to actually stand on his 2 feet in the morning. Again, something which one cannot and must not take for granted. There are, after all, many people who do awake in the morning but cannot stand on their 2 feet for many various reasons. Immediately upon experiencing one of these realities, one of these new beginnings, as it were, of each day, one has to thank HaShem, and one obviously will feel greater gratitude, and one will have much more, a much more intense and moving and elevating experience when one takes note of these things immediately as they happen and thanks Hashem immediately, as opposed to what? As opposed to delaying saying these barachot in their proper time, and later at some point, whether it's half an hour later or an hour and a half later, making these statements, saying these barachot, especially if one says them one after the other, one tends to not really have the time or the patience or the ability to focus on each bracha and the facet of beginning a new day to which each of those barachot refer. It is very important to mention and to emphasize one more point, and that is that according to what we find in the Talmud, which describes a person waking up, as we mentioned, and making a certain bracha just for the fact that he awoke, and then reciting a bracha when one sits up on one's bed, or when one stands on the floor, and then getting dressed, etc. There is a bracha, as we explained, for each of these actions, to thank Hashem, to internalize the fact that each of these actions, each of these facts, in and of themselves are very noteworthy and require our attention, that we take note of these things and thank Hashem that we are able to do these things, that we have these material benefits and all that we require. It is only after mentioning these barachot that the Talmud mentions that after so doing, one washes one's hands. Was talking about washing one's hands with a vessel, as one does before eating bread, for example, and saying the baracha al natilat yadayim. And this is also how these barachot that are mentioned, that are recited immediately upon waking, this is how this is also quoted in the halachot gedolot, which is one of the very earliest post-Talmudic halachic sources that we have, and in the Sidur of Rav Natronai Gaon, and in Rambam's Mishneh Torah, etc. Now, in other words, the point is that according to the plain reading of the Talmud, making these barachot before washing one's hands is entirely correct and proper. It is not necessary to wash one's hands before reciting these barachot. In fact, it is not correct to do so. The correct procedure is to follow the clear, plain instruction of the Talmud and to act in accordance with what we find there. And later, essentially as a preparation for Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, for prayer, one washes one's hands with a vessel and says Al Natilat Yadayim. And this fact is also stressed by the Rosh and the Tur, who we will speak about later. They also very plainly stress and mention the fact more than once that a plain reading of the Talmud indicates that these barachot that one recites at the very beginning of each day are to be said before one washes one's hands. This state of affairs, however, took a turn. There was a twist in the story. In the middle of the Gaonic period, we're talking about the middle of the 9th century according to the Christian calendar, one of the better known and more illustrious of the Gaonim, Rav Natronai Gaon, who was the head of the great yeshiva, the great Torah Academy in Sura in Babylon in the mid-9th century, between the years 853 and 858. He was the head of the Yeshiva in Surah, we find a teshuvah that he wrote. And I will quote just a couple of lines from this teshuvah. And as we shall see, this teshuvah of Rav Natronai Gaon, this halachic responsum, had a very great impact on halachic practice throughout the Jewish world. In the most recent edition of the Teshuvot, the responsa of Rav Natronai Gaon, in the first volume on page 106, this is Siman Tef, he's asked the question, he's asked to explain what are the 100 barachot that the Talmud refers to, that a Jew should make every day. From the moment he gets up until the moment he goes to sleep, a Jew is required to make, to say many various barachot, blessings, and tefillot, and prayers. And he gives a list of all these barachot, and he says as follows. He says, Amru hachamim b'haro'e makom. In other words, the sages state in that section of the Talmud that we quoted in Masechet Barachot Daf Samech, Kedepatach eineh ma'yomah. What does one say upon opening one's eyes? One says such and such. Ki lavesh, when one gets dressed, one says such and such. Umashma dechol ahath wa ahath lomera be'ita uvimkoma. Rav Natronai Gaon states and admits freely that a plain and straightforward understanding of the Talmudic text indicates that one recites each of these barachot in connection with a specific action that one does upon waking, as we described. However, immediately after quoting the Talmud and stating that according to what the Talmud states, it is obvious that one recites each of these barachot in connection with a particular action, and this is done before one washes one's hands. He goes on to say, Ela mishum hatinuf kach halacha, which means simply we have to assume that a person's hands are unclean upon waking, and therefore, as he goes on to explain, as we will read in one moment, therefore one must wash one's hands before one recites any baracha in the morning upon waking. And therefore he says as follows, Kewan shenin'ar adam mishanatho. As soon as a person therefore wakes in the morning, asur levarech afilu baracha ahath ad shilhos yado. A person may not recite any baracha until he washes his hands. And he quotes the pasuk from the Navi, from the prophet Amos, Hikon likrat Elohecha Yisrael. One has to prepare oneself before standing before HaShem. This pasuk is quoted by Hazal, by the sages, in connection with the requirement to wash one's hands before praying, that is to say, before reciting the Shmoneh Esrei, but not with regards to making any of the other barachot. Here, Rav Natronai Gaon quotes this pasuk and says this applies to reciting any bracha. And therefore, he says as follows, Lefichach, Kewan she'omed adam mishanatho. As soon as a person wakes up, what should he do? He first has to cleanse himself. By this he means that one should attend to one's bodily needs, go to the bathroom, etc. Umethaken asmo, which appears in other sources. Umekanach asmo. In other words, he cleans himself. Unotelia though, and then he washes his hands and his face. He also mentions washing one's feet in this teshuvah here, which is a separate discussion, whether this is in fact necessary or not. Umevarech al haseder, and then he begins to recite all of these barachot that we mentioned in order, that is to say, one after the other. And seeing therefore, based on what we just said, says Rav Natronai, that one is unable to recite any bracha before washing one's hands, nimsa methaken et asmo livrachot u'letfilah be'othar hisa. And therefore, according to what I am explaining here, says Rav Natronai Gaon, one prepares oneself in the morning and stands up and gets dressed, etc., etc., and then one washes one's hands and says the bracha al netilat yadayim, And this netilah, this washing of the hands, is therefore both for the purpose of being able to recite these various brachot that we recite upon waking, and also for that which he is about to do presently, or shortly after that, and that is to recite Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, Shmona Esrei. So this one netilah suffices for all of the above. So, to briefly summarize what we have just learned, we find in this teshuvah, this halachic responsum of Rav Natronai Gaon in the middle of the 9th century, according to the Christian calendar, we learn something that we refer to in Torah study as a hidush, something which has not been heard or stated before. Namely, that one may not recite any beracha, any blessing, upon waking in the morning before washing one's hands. The reason for this is, he states, because one assumes that a person's hands are unclean upon waking, and therefore one is not in a proper state to, as it were, speak to HaShem or mention HaShem's name before washing one's hands. This teshuvah of Rav Natronai Gaon was quoted by his immediate successor, the head of the yeshiva in Surah in Bavel in Babylon, Rav Amram Gaon, in his famous Seder or Sidur Rav Amram Gaon, which is essentially the earliest Sidur Tefillah, the earliest order of prayer and collection of liturgical materials and halachic information regarding Tefillah, prayer, that we have. This Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, who was the Gaon, the head of the yeshiva in Surah immediately after Rav Natronai Gaon. In fact, he was appointed Gaon, that is to say, head of the yeshiva, already in the lifetime of Rav Natronai Gaon. He sort of acted as his deputy as long as Rav Natronai Gaon was alive. So he was actually the head of the yeshiva in Surah from 853 to 871, according to the Christian calendar. This Seder of Rav Amram Gaon was actually a work that he wrote in response to a question that was sent to him by a Jewish community in Spain at that time. And he quotes this teshuvah of Rav Natronai Gaon. The fact that Rav Amram Gaon's Sidur was very widely disseminated throughout the Jewish world, in all Jewish communities across the globe essentially, and therefore had a very great impact on halachic practice in almost all parts of the Jewish world. We see this plainly in early sources going back to the late Gaonic period and the early period of the Rishonim in Spain. In other words, the positions and the nushaot, the versions of tefillah and the halachic positions that we find in Seder of Amram Gaon were almost without exception accepted in Spain and later in other parts of the Jewish world. And as a result, this became the standard practice throughout the Jewish world, that one does not recite these barachot in the morning as described in the Talmud, that is to say, each baracha as described as it should be said immediately upon waking or upon standing up or upon getting dressed, etc., but only after washing one's hands at the end of all these actions and all of the various things that one does upon waking. And therefore these barachot became something that one recites, one baracha after the other. They appear therefore in every Sidur today in such a fashion. One of the interesting facts that can be noted when one sees how this teshuvah is presented in Seder of Amram Gaon, the teshuvah of Rav Natronai Gaon, we find there a somewhat expanded version or explanation of what Rav Natronai wrote regarding a person's hands being unclean in the morning. He says the assumption is that when one is asleep, and one has to keep in mind that people in those days, generally speaking, slept naked. He says a person's hands are are not under his control when he is asleep, obviously, and we assume that he touches various parts of his body during the night, and therefore the hands are not considered to be clean. And that is the reason given by Rav Natronai Gaon and others who quote this responsum of Rav Natronai, why we make this assumption regarding one's hands. In an aside, I would mention that I think it would be quite reasonable to assume that the reality that pertained at that time, with regards to most people, in terms of the hygienic standards of that period, were very different from what pertain, generally speaking, nowadays. In those days, people did not bathe every day. We find, for instance, in various sources that bathing once a week, Erev Shabbat, Lichvot Shabbat, was the standard practice. And this was true for all peoples in those parts of the world. In Europe at that time, for example, that was entirely not so. Most people bathed perhaps once a year in medieval Europe. But Jews, as a rule, always bathed in hot water, Lichvot Shabbat, on Fridays. But certainly people did not shower every day. People did not have such facilities, and this was unheard of. So one can perhaps understand that this statement is based on a certain hygienic reality that existed at that time. However, it would be equally correct to point out that the hygienic standards and realities of the Gaonic period, the middle of the 9th century, when compared to those that existed in Eretz Yisrael and the land of Israel in the time of Hazal and the Mishnaic period or the Talmudic period, if we're speaking, for example, about the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, according to the Christian calendar, those realities, of course, did not change. They were essentially the same. So this is not really a very convincing argument. I'm just stating, to put things into their historical context, that this attitude, this assumption regarding the cleanliness of a person's hands upon waking is based on a certain reality, but nevertheless, clearly, Chazal, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, did not feel that this was this practice or this suggestion of Rav Natronai of having to wash one's hands before reciting a bracha. They obviously did not feel that this was correct and necessary, and in fact the Talmud states quite the opposite. I should also mention here that while we do find many authorities after the time of Rav Natronai Gaon, who quotes Rav Natronai Gaon, while it is true that we find many authorities adopting this position, this halachic position, therefore requiring one to wash one's hands before reciting any bracha, which therefore means that one does not recite the brachot in connection with every specific action as described in the Talmud, as we read in the Rambam, which of course leads to a totally different reality regarding the recitation of these brachot, as we will speak about further in a moment. While all this is true, it is not correct to assume that all authorities accepted this position. A little bit less than 1 century after Rav Natronai Gaon, the head of the yeshiva in Surah was Rav Saadia Gaon, who also wrote an entire sidur, an order of tefillah, including all the barachot and various prayers, etc., with his halachic annotations and explanations and the decisions. There, Rav Saadia Gaon, for example, quotes the statements of the Talmud as they appear there. That is to say, he says that upon waking one recites this bracha, and upon opening one's eyes one recites another bracha, and upon standing up one recites a third bracha, etc., as described in the Talmud, as we read. And that is his his approach, that is his position, halakha lema'aseh, in practical terms. In other words, he does not accept this view of Rav Amram and Rav Natronai Gaon, even though there is no doubt, there can be absolutely no doubt, that he was fully aware of this practice. And if there is any doubt about this, we just have to continue reading in Rav Sa'adia Gaon's Sidur, where we find that immediately after describing the proper order of reciting these brachot in the morning, as described in the Talmud, he goes on to say that Rov Havirenu, most of our friends and colleagues, however, do not follow this practice, which I have just mentioned here. However, he says, after having gone to the bathroom and having taken care of their bodily needs and having washed their hands, he says, then they recite all these brachot. He mentions this as the standard custom, the minhag, which was already commonplace, perhaps not the only custom, the only practice that existed at that time, but it was already a well-known and well-established minhag in the days already of Rav Sa'adia Gaon. So we see that within a relatively short span of time, something like probably 70 or 80 years at the most, we see that this position, this halachic position of Rav Natronai Gaon, made famous and disseminated throughout the world by Rav Amram Gaon, this had a tremendous impact on a halachic practice throughout the Jewish world. However, again, not all authorities agreed. Rav Sa'adia Gaon is one such authority. Another halachic authority, who clearly rejects Rav Natronai's position, is Rambam, as is obvious from what we read earlier. Rambam quotes the statements of the Talmud precisely, lists the brachot as mentioned in the Talmud, that each of these brachot is to be said in connection with the specific action at a particular time. He makes no connection whatever between reciting these brachot and washing one's hands, and he only mentions washing one's hands later, after he goes through the many other brachot that one recites upon waking and getting dressed, etc., exactly as the Talmud does. The Talmud does the same thing. The Talmud first mentions waking up, opening one's eyes, sitting up, standing up, getting dressed, etc., washing one's face, for which one makes a bracha as well. And only after all of this does the Talmud mention washing one's hands and reciting the bracha al natilat yodayim. So we see that there were many authorities who did not accept this position. Furthermore, as mentioned, the Rosh and his son the Tur, who were also very much aware of this position of Rav Amram Gaon and Rav Natronai Gaon, which became the standard position and practice throughout the Jewish world, they mention that this is the usual position, this is what most people are doing, but they also go out of their way to stress, and I think it's quite plain when one reads particularly the words of the Rosh, one reads those words carefully, even without really having to read between the lines, one senses clearly that the Rosh was not entirely satisfied with or in agreement with this halachic practice. He understood that this was the reality. He mentions this as being such, but he also stresses that this is not what the Talmud teaches us. Now, at this stage, I'm quite sure that some of you are asking yourselves, what's the big deal? Does it really matter if one waits to recite these various brachot in the morning until one washes one's hands, or if one recites them as part of the tefillah, part of shaharit, as it were, from the Sidur or what have you in the Beit Knesset, in the Shul, even though they are divorced from the actions to which they are referring? Is that really such a problem? Why is it so important that it not be done so? Therefore, I wish to explain why I think it is very important that the original practice outlined in the Talmud and mentioned in many of the earliest sources that we have, as we explained before, sources like the Halachot Gedolot and Rav Sa'adia Gaon and Rambam, and also reiterated by sources somewhat after the Rambam, such as the Rosh and the Tur, who made it clear that this was the original intention of the Talmud. And one could also mention here that the Gra and some of his students apparently also adopted this position. This practice should be adopted and readopted and be made known to people today. The reason I say this is because I think there is an immense difference between a person who immediately upon waking takes note of the fact that he has in fact awoken, which, as we mentioned, is not something that a person can or should take for granted. If a person wakes up and immediately recites the relevant baracha, according to the Talmud Bavli, the baracha is Elohai Neshama Shenatata Bi, etc., as we know, as it appears in all Sidurim. According to Nusach Eretz Yisrael, it begins with a Hatima or a Petiha, Baruch Ata Hashem, Hamatir Kavle Shena, and it goes on to end with the bracha Baruch Ata Hashem Mehaya Methim. A person who recites this bracha immediately upon waking will, I'm convinced, much more fully internalize and appreciate the fact that Hashem has granted him life and consciousness once again for one more day, and the thrust of that bracha, the great profundity that it contains, and the lesson that a person who recites this bracha immediately upon waking can and must take to heart, and also something that he can carry with him throughout the day. The bracha, when recited in that fashion, in its proper time, immediately upon waking, will be vastly more meaningful and will have a much greater impact on a person's understanding, awareness, and cognizance of such realities. And that is exactly the purpose of the bracha. And the same is true of all the other brachot. If a person gets dressed in the morning without making the bracha malbish arumim, and then sometime later recites this bracha together with many other brachot, one after the other, which tends to create a situation in which a person is sort of running through the bracha, each of those brachot, so that none of those brachot in and of itself really receives the proper attention and focus that each of those brachot deserves and demands, then a person does not and will not appreciate the fact that Hashem is malbish arumim, and that he has clothes to wear and shoes to wear on his feet, for which we say the bracha she'asali kol sarachai. A person will appreciate this infinitely more if one recites these brachot immediately, as opposed to saying them sometime later in the day. There cannot be the same kind of kavanah, the same kind of heartfelt intent, the same kind of internalization, the same form of avodat Hashem that is taking place when a person recites each of these bracha in its proper time, in the proper way, as opposed to delaying doing so, reciting it together with other brachot much later, or even some short time later, but not immediately when one performs the specific action in question. I do not believe there can be any real comparison between these two things. The essential issue, therefore, is avodat Hashem. And seeing that this is the issue, this is the purpose, this is the aim, this is the raison d'etre for these barachot. And if we add to this the basic fact that Hazal, the Hachamim of the Mishnah and the Talmud, did not consider it in any way problematic to make these brachot before washing one's hands, as is clear from the Talmud, then if we look at this statement, this hidush of Rav Natronai Gaon, that one must wash one's hands before reciting any of Birkot HaShachar, one quickly realizes that this is in fact a humra da'athar lidei qula. This is a stringency, or it appears to be a kind of stringency, adopting a more demanding halachic standard, as it were, but in fact it is doing the opposite. It is creating a reality whereby people rattle off these brachot one after the other, almost in a kind of machine gun style, where the brachot are sent forth from the mouth in rapid succession without any real chance or possibility of thinking seriously about what one is saying and what this bracha refers to. And therefore this practice is, in my view, very, very dubious. And it also, by the way, leads to another problem. And that is that people, as a result of this practice, which was, as we have explained, was widely accepted, people began to see these barachot as one more part of the morning service, one more part of Tefillat Shacharit. It's just something that you say from the Siddur or without the Siddur. You say it in the Beth Knesset, in the Shul, usually. That's what many people do, most people do. And therefore you do not really, you lose, again, as we've explained, you lose the connection. You don't see the connection between the bracha and the action, or the bracha and the reality of waking up in the morning, for example. And then this automatically and inexorably leads to a practice or a conclusion that one needs to say these barachot whether or not one actually performed this action, or whether one enjoyed such a benefit or such some such blessing from HaShem that particular morning. For example, if a person slept in his clothes for whatever reason, then upon waking in the morning, one should not say Malbish Arumim, because now, for you at this moment, this is not relevant. If at a later point in the day, for example, that person would undress and then dress later during the day, then it would be entirely reasonable to say that bracha at that point. But now, upon waking, having slept in one's clothes, there is no reason to make this bracha. Similarly, if a person did not sleep at night for whatever reason, I'm not talking about sleeping a short period of time, I'm talking about not having slept at all, then there is no reason at all to make the bracha Elohai Neshama or Mahya Mithim. There is no reason, no logical reason why this should be the case. And this is precisely what Rambam tells us in Perek Shvi'i, the 7th chapter of Ilchot Tefillah, Uvirkat Kohanim, Halacha Zayin. Rambam says, these brachot ein lahem seder, they have no particular order. It's not, as we see in Sidurim, that these brachot are printed one after the other in a certain order, and that is how one has to recite them. No, not at all. Rambam says, Ela mevarech kol ahat mehen al davar shah bracha bishvilo. One is to recite each of these brachot for the relevant action or thing to which the bracha relates, b'sha'atho, at the correct time. And he goes on to explain. He says, for example, if one first got dressed and then only later heard the rooster crowing in the morning, then one says first the bracha for getting dressed, and then later the bracha for hearing the rooster, which we discussed earlier, the significance of and the benefit to human beings, at least in earlier times, of the existence and of roosters in the world, waking people up and announcing the morning, etc., the great benefit that this brought to people. In other words, there is no order, says Rambam. And similarly, he says, "V'chol baracha mehen shelo nitchayev ba," and any baracha that a person does not have the reason or the need to recite this bracha because he didn't perform or have anything to do with that particular action this morning so far, he does not say that bracha, and he goes on to give an example. If a person slept in his clothes, when he wakes up, he does not recite the bracha. And if he walks barefoot and does not wear shoes, and then Rambam goes on and says one more thing which is very relevant to our discussion. In Halakha Teth, Rambam says, Naharu ha'am berov arenu. It is the custom of most people in most of our cities, most of our areas where we live, there are areas with which the Rambam was familiar, levarech barachot elu kulan zo ahar zo, to recite all these barachot bevet HaKnesset, one after the other. Ben nidhayavu bahen, ben lo nidhayavu bahen, whether they are in fact required to recite all of those barachot or not. Again, if a person slept in his clothes, then he shouldn't make that baracha. But Rambam says people are just saying these barachot without any reference to what they in fact did or did not do that morning. And Rambam says, with ta'uthi, and this is a mistake, this practice, وَأَنْ رَؤُي لَعَصَوْ كَنْ, and it is incorrect to do so. وَلَوْ يَبَرَخَ ذَنْ بَرَخَ إِلَّا إِمْ كَنْ نِتْحَيَفْ بَ, and a person should not make the baracha, any of these barachot, unless he is in fact required to do so, unless he in fact performed that action or benefited from that particular thing. It is very important that we understand what in fact took place here. We are talking about a two-stage process. First of all, stage one, Rav Natronai Gaon comes up with a new idea, a hidush, namely that one must not recite any barachot in the morning, one must not mention the name of HaShem before washing one's hands. This was accepted by some authorities, and for various historical reasons, this became the widely accepted position of most Jewish communities around the world. As a result of this humrah, of this apparent stringency, whereby a person would not recite any bracha until he had washed his hands, this resulted in obviously reciting the barachot after washing one's hands, and this often happened in the Beth Knesset, in the shul. And even if it didn't happen in the shul, it does not really matter. The person would get used to the idea of reciting all these barachot one after the other, without the obvious and direct and immediate connection to the action involved. This then, and this is stage two, this led to another development, namely the feeling or the assumption that these barachot are a set piece, part of the tefillah shaharith, part of the morning order of service, something that one must recite whether one did or did not do any particular thing, or whether one heard a rooster or not, whether one got dressed that morning, whether one washed one's face that morning, whether one slept at night or not, etc. And therefore, even though Rav Natronai Gaon does not explicitly say this, neither does Rav Amram Gaon, who quotes Rav Natronai Gaon, and who in fact was responsible for Rav Natronai Gaon's position and his new concept of not reciting any bracha in the morning without washing one's hands. Rav Amram Gaon was responsible for making this view widely known and accepted. Neither of them say anything explicitly about reciting a bracha if you did not do a particular thing. Rav Natronai Gaon does not state that if you did not get dressed this morning because you slept in your clothes, that you do not make that bracha. He does not say this, or anything along those lines. But others who came in their footsteps, who did accept that position, then went on to make the assumption, and in some cases to explicitly state that this is correct halachically speaking, to recite all these barachot in the morning, whether you happen to have done these things or not. And the explanation was that it has nothing to do with you personally, but rather it is a bracha which relates to the hidush ma'aseh v'reshith, that is to say, the renewing of the order of the world, the created order of the world, every day anew. In other words, when we say Malbish Arumim, we're not referring to what we ourselves are doing. It's a general reference to the fact that Hashem provides the wherewithal for people to clothe themselves every day. And that, of course, is also part of the bracha. That is part of what the bracha is saying, and that is why it is couched in such terms. Malbish Arumim is a general statement in the plural, and it refers to the reality of the world as we know it. For all people, that is true. But the Talmud explicitly connects it to what a person does or does not do. And because it also has a lot to do with the individual's benefit and enjoyment from a particular thing that he has that morning, whether it's clothing or shoes that he's wearing. And that is also an essential part of the bracha. An essential component of saying these brachot is the appreciation for what one has, thanking Hashem and recognizing that Hashem gives to each of us these things every day anew. It is true. Another component of the bracha is that it refers to the general order of reality, that Hashem does this for all people. But if one refers only to the one and not to the other, one is doing something which is not correct and not complete. It is only part of the picture, not the whole picture. So in this two-stage process, originally the brachot were delayed and recited together, not individually, not with reference to anything in particular, anything specific or physical or real that happened to a person at that moment. And then as a second stage, the brachot became general statements about Hashem's running of the world, and were entirely removed, almost entirely removed, from one's personal experience, the subjective individual experience. And this is a problem, and this is exactly what Rambam is referring to. Rambam was entirely and completely aware both of the position of Rav Natronai Gaon and Rav Amram Gaon, whose works he had before him, without any doubt. There cannot be the slightest doubt about that. He was aware of what their position was regarding making brachot only after having washed one's hands. This he explicitly rejected, as we have seen, as did all the other Rishonim, who simply quoted the Talmud without mentioning any such notion as that mentioned by Rav Natronai Gaon. So we mentioned the Halachot Gedolot and Rav Saadia Gaon and the Rif and others. So all these Chachamim rejected this notion. Rambam here goes out of his way to stress and let us know that there is another facet to this issue, and that is that it has led to a new reality. This humrah, which is in fact not really a humrah at all, but quite the opposite, has led to a reality in which people are reciting these brachot, one after the other, in the Beit Knesset, as Rambam writes, even if they are in fact not required to do so, and therefore these are made as they have become, in some cases, a bracha levatala. I'm adding that even if we put aside the issue of a bracha levatala for one moment, for taking Hashem's name in vain when one is not required to do so, a bracha that is said, or these brachot rather, when they are said one after the other, as some kind of a package, without really clearly and obviously feeling the connection between each of those brachot and the particular thing to which it refers, these brachot lose their impact and their real meaning, and at best one is perhaps thinking about or can be aware of the more general reference to what Hashem does in the world and how He renews the world which we know in which human beings reside and live and can clothe themselves and wake up in the morning and be functional, etc. One can perhaps grasp some of that, but the subjective individual side of it is, I think, largely lost. And this is why Rambam and the others that we mentioned were so opposed to this practice. So in the long run, therefore, having looked at this issue from all angles, I think we can see that there is a definite loss in terms of Avodat Hashem, the true meaning of these brachot and their purpose, and what a person can really gain and feel and internalize every day anew, the real meaning and impact and thrust of these brachot is largely lost when it is done in the way that it has become customary to do so. And that is why I think that one should change one's practice and adopt the original intention of the Chachamim and of many of the Geonim and Rishonim. Not all, that is true, but many, including some latter-day Posekim, such as the Gra, and some of his students and followers, from what we know from certain sources, and recite all of these brachot in their proper time, each connected to the relevant action, and thus turn each of these brachot, each one in and of itself, into a special, unique, and very meaningful and real form of Avodat Hashem.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkot Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.